Hey everybody, it's Mike Yao with Savage Kingdoms role-playing game and Fire in the Head Productions, my little game company and theater company. Thought I'd do a video today about the differences between high fantasy and sword and sorcery. Those are two primary subgenres of fantasy. Obviously, there are other subgenres as well, such as modern fantasy, which is typically like kind of your Harry Potter, although it does wax slightly medieval fantasy-ish, even though it's not set in that era, but there are elements of it. And various other types of urban fantasy, etc. Wait, I think I just said that one. So we're going to talk about sword and sorcery, particularly because I want to illustrate the difference between. So the new game I'm working on, as you may or may not know, is called Red Sun. Red Sun is a classic sword and sorcery game set in a sword and sorcery environment. It's actually in the same setting as my Savage Kingdoms game, which is not high fantasy either. I called it sword and sorcery at the beginning, Savage Kingdoms, and it still says it in the logo. It says heroic sword and sorcery role-playing game. It's not quite exactly, but kinda. It is, I would say, mostly sword and sorcery, but there is some high fantasy elements. But my new game, Red Sun, is very specifically classic sword and sorcery in the vein of Frank Frazetta and Robert E. Howard and to some degree Michael Moorcock. The reason I say some degree is Michael Moorcock was actually kind of anti-sword and sorcery. He did it deliberately like this skinny, pale, sick hero, physically sick hero who had this very powerful sword, whereas, for example, Conan of Samaria, Conan the Barbarian, was physically fit and very athletic, and he was kind of doing the opposite. But it still was set within the genre and the setting of sword and sorcery, which had a lot of those very similar elements. So today, yeah, the difference between high fantasy and sword and sorcery. Now, there are other videos on the internet that go into this. Some of them are quite good. Actually, most of them are really quite good. There's a few things that a couple that were never really hit upon. So, one thing is that in high fantasy, for example, that's the best example is Lord of the Rings. That's literally the author who established that subgenre. And of course, at the time, Tolkien was just writing fantasy. And then over time, fantasy got to be a very large genre, as we know. Most of us, probably everybody watching this video, likes that genre or loves that genre to some degree. And so there were all these kind of subgenres formed, right? Robert E. Howard was writing even really before Tolkien was writing The Hobbit, so it's arguably even slightly older. But again, it wasn't really called that until a little bit later. It was just kind of its own thing. But Howard is credited as being the grandfather of sword and sorcery because he really kind of established that sort of subgenre of fantasy. So when Tolkien and Howard were both kind of being pretty prolific in the 30s, and of course Lord of the Rings was in 1955, if I recall. By that time, Lord of the Rings came out, it was pretty established, the different subgenres of fantasy, particularly the big two, which was high fantasy and sword and sorcery. So what I was getting at, I got distracted there, was some of the differences, right? So in high fantasy, you have a lot of people say it's called high fantasy because there's high magic involved. That's not necessarily the case. Although magic is more either prominent, like more common, or if it's not as common, such as in Middle Earth, it's just there are things in general that are sort of more magical, mystical, enchanted, not necessarily spellcraft, that sort of thing. I think sometimes gamers have this weird gamer way of thinking of things, and sometimes I think that throws us off a little bit as far as to what's really going on thematically inside of a fantasy story, that sort of thing. What's magical and what's not, what's sorcery, what's not, what's witchcraft, etc. All these different kind of subtypes of what we generically call magic, which is a giant subtype, which is why I don't use that term actually that often. That's probably for a whole different video. So high fantasy is dealing with big earth-shattering, if you will, or planet-shattering consequences such as a Dark Lord. And the heroes typically are good aligned, but they're typically of good heart for the most part. Some might be slightly gray. But black and white is a very common theme within high fantasy. You've got your forces of good, your forces of evil or darkness, and then maybe there's a little bit of gray in between, but not really. It's not really um, detailed a whole lot. There might be a character that slides gray, such as Boromir. Lord of the Rings is a good example because he was corrupted by the ring. Wasn't really his fault, other than maybe not having as strong a will as he should have. But the ring was super powerful, as we know. Whereas in sword and sorcery, morality is more gray. It's more what I call tribal morality, or what others have called tribal morality, where it's meaning that morality really only goes so far as your tribe, like, right, your clan of people, your tribe, maybe even extended into a small nation of like-minded people, um, same or similar culture, language, religion, etc. Those might be considered your tribe, right? And so your ethics, or the way you behave with people of that tribe or nation or clan, is typically good, right? And that's it's for a reason. You need your people to survive the winter. You don't need to be kin. That's why being a kinslayer is such a big thing in these games. That's why I think some of the younger people don't sometimes quite get, like, obviously killing someone's a bad thing, but what's the big deal about a kinslayer and then just killing some other random person? Because it was a bigger deal to kill someone of your family. It was your own blood, but also that might have been part of your war band that you were going to use to defend the enemy tribe coming across the mountain range in a couple of months. Or that same war band might also be a hunting party that has to go out and hunt for the winter stores, or else your clan's not going to survive, or most of them are not. So it was all about a band of brothers, and so that's how your tribal morality got around. You protected you acted awesome to your own people, but beyond that, they may or may not have been. Morality would have been, so to speak, would have been more gray. Now it would have still been there, because you have to deal with. So if you meet a merchant from far away, and he's like, well, this person's trading some goods that we do not have. Presumably we have something he doesn't, and that's how we can make the trade, and blah blah blah. That's how early merchant craft worked, obviously, and still does. So maybe you're kind to the degree, or at least honorable, of that merchant coming in to your lands. But again, that's only because that person really needs something. If it's just some random person coming into your tribal land and they really have nothing to offer, your morality and ethics may have only been, uh, gray at the most. It might be even dark, because here's a person that could be taking more of your resources away for the winter or whatever. Um, so the whole idea of kind of being nice to people just for no reason, I mean, obviously that exists in the actual uh, antiquated world and the medieval age as well, but also in fantasy, certainly. But it probably wasn't quite as common as we might kind of do nowadays, because I think, again, at a tribal or clan level, things were a little more practical as far as survival goes. Um, this is a pretty violent world in most instances, and a lot of that is carried over into medieval fantasy and sword and sorcery, because that kind of appeals to us as far as a uh, telling adventurous stories, and stories of daring do and heroic stuff. Right, you have to overcome things like that, such as warfare or survival and that kind of thing. So that's where the fantasy element comes from. So another thing that sword and sorcery might be different than high fantasy, other than the uh, saving the world sort of thing, the sword and sorcery characters typically are antagonists in this case, or player characters in a gaming sense. They're usually not on grand adventures. They're not interested in saving in the entire world. In fact, that's like, some of them don't even really know what their world is. Kind of like I said, it might be just a kingdom. They might know there's a faraway kingdom across the mountain range, or across the desert, or across the sea. And that's kind of your world. We're not typically talking planet. We're talking about world when it comes to more grounded sword and sorcery, or sort of low fantasy storytelling. Um, so yeah, whereas in high fantasy, it might be more recognized that there's this whole grander world out there, and there's other lands. And this goes back to some of the Conan stories with Robert E. Howard, because that's always a good example for sword and sorcery. Uh, reason the stories, well, all of the actual official stories, the 19 sagas that Howard wrote, Although none of them take place in Samaria. It's mentioned a few times, and Conan even mentions it a couple times, but it's not. None of the stories actually take place there, and that's because he's doing this thing of what I just kind of mentioned, that Conan thinks about, oh, there's another land across the mountain range, or across this dark forest is this place I've never seen, and I must go there. And he's going there for reasons when he was younger, just out of curiosity, but also he's going there for resources. Maybe there's and maybe there's another culture to make contact with. Maybe there's a village that could be easily raided for their gold or for their whatever resources they might have. And so that's where all the adventure sort of comes from. Is that this? And of course, we know in Conan, though, his Howard gave him. He didn't give him those reasons that he's seeking. He's going out scouting for resources for people. It was more Conan was getting out of Samaria because it was very dark and brooding, and he just didn't find any hope there. And either that's true, or more likely, Conan was young at the time, only about 16, 15 or 16, and he was probably looking at it like a 15 or 16-year-old boy probably typically is. Oh my God, there's no hope. Not knowing that there is, you just have to look a little deeper and maybe work a little harder to find these elements of light and hope. Um, but, God's bless him, he left and went to Zamora first, I believe. The Tower of the Element is chronologically, Tower of the Elephant is typically regarded as one of the earlier stories in his. Actually, I think Frost Giant's daughter might have technically happened just before. Howard never super organized it, but if you read the stories, you can generally tell how old, and sometimes it's even mentioned about how old Conan is, and you can almost kind of track across the Hyborian Age continent of Thuria where he's kind of been, and that sort of thing. So that's another cool thing about those elements. Um, And here's something from the Red Sun rules that I have written. So right now we're just in play testing. But early on in the book, or the current playtest rules, there's a little chapter that says Sword and Sorcery Thematics. And I've kind of summarized some over there. So basically, just not to necessarily read the whole thing here, but it's just a few paragraphs. It says Sword and Sorcery Thematics. This is, again, on like page 2 of the current 4.3, I think is what I'm up to now, playtest rules of Red Sun. Red Sun is inspired largely by old school sword and sorcery, particularly of the. Hold on, I won't retape this, so just bear with me. I'm going to slide my zoom over here. So if I'm looking off center, you will now know why, because I'm going to drag this window out a bit more, which I should have done in the first place. I do apologize. There we go. Right. So, sword and sorcery thematics. Red Sun is inspired largely by old school sword and sorcery, particularly of the pulp variety, with famous authors such as the great Robert E. Howard, the grandfather of sword and sorcery, Fritz Leiber, Moorcock, Heavy Metal Magazine, Frank Frazetta, and a host of other influences. However, the Red Sun setting and game system is its own thing. In the end, even as much as the themes and feel of outside inspirations affect it. As you may know, sword and sorcery is a subgenre of fantasy with flashing blades, dark magic, and ancient world set dressing, very similar to what is called medieval fantasy. Yet, sword and sorcery is generally set in an age of antiquity, an age undreamed of, as a certain grandfather of the genre once wrote, and tends to deal with short-term adventures instead of world-saving epics that the subgenre of high fantasy so often generates. In addition, SNS, or Sword and Sorcery, is generally more grounded, despite some occasionally weird and wondrous aspects, while most other types of fantasy are less so. Relatedly, Sword and Sorcery focuses more on humans, perhaps from varying and rich cultures, striving against the unknown and the supernatural, and so non-human PCs should be rare or even non-existent at the discretion of your GM, and it goes into that later in the rules. Last paragraph. Lastly, magic tends to be dark and dangerous in sword and sorcery fiction, which is why the term sorcery is at least as it is applies to the genre, is looked at as derogatory by the common populace, dealing with powers only learned through eldritch pacts with hellish entities, rotting scrolls written by half-human overlords or worse. Though it is often therefore it is often cold steel that wins the day, or if not that, cleverness, daring do, and bold valor. All right, so that was like 3 paragraphs, like half the page. And I just read that so you can see that I think that I've tried to anyway summarize the gist of sword and sorcery, and also how it might apply to the Red Sun rule system, which is why it's there. So, what else can I mention that I might not have put in that video that's kind of a difference between sword and sorcery? So I mentioned gray morality, right? I mentioned it's more grounded and more local than it is like broad world saving or world shattering. Although you could do that with sword and sorcery, but you kind of start breaking genre at that point. But you could ramp up to it with smaller sword and sorcery adventures leading to a grander Thulsa Doom type opponent, for example, to use a Robert E. Howard villain who actually was from Krull, from Kull, by the way, and not Conan. But in the movie, they put him in Conan because he's cool. And it's still Howard, right? Still the same author. So another thing would be in sword and sorcery. Oh yeah, no. The other thing I want to touch on is technology level. And again, this is a fantasy, but again, like most medieval fantasy, which is why it's called that, or sword and sorcery, it is grounded in a real world sort of time frame to a degree, because that's just storytelling. That's just anybody knows to do that for storytelling. It's called shortcutting. That way, everybody, if you say he's from a Celtic-like culture, everybody, if you know anything about the Celts, you automatically have all of that in your head, and nothing else has to be explained. Other than, maybe you could go into some more detail. If it's just Celtic-ish, and then you have different changes to it. So, yeah, with just one or two words, you can kind of convey these real-world things. So, in Sword and Sorcery, particularly in Red Sun, I've put it in a Bronze Age of the world. And it's the same world as Savage Kingdoms. I think I mentioned that earlier. It's the same planet, Torion. So it is so I've confirmed that it is a spherical world. It's not a flat world or anything weird or cube-shaped or D20 shaped or D8 shaped. It is a round sphere as far as we know, and there's 2 moons. There's a big red sun, which is why the game is called Red Sun. Actually, that's just one of 5 reasons. So it's a red giant. Not to go, I've already, because I mentioned this in past videos, but other reasons it's called Red Sun. It's also indicative of Dark Sun, which is probably my favorite D&D setting. It's kind of sword and sorcery-ish, or at least homaged Red Sonja, a very popular sword and sorcery character, although originally she was like 16th century character, but Elsbrag de Camp, I think, is the one that put her in the Hyborian Age with Conan, which is cool. I think she fits there better, actually. And then there was an old term that the Vikings would use going, a red sun rises, meaning that blood will be spilt. Yeah, and there's a 5th reason that I can't remember, but that's the 4 reasons why it's called Red Sun. The main one, that there literally is a red giant sun, but then there's all those other little hints up there. So that's kind of why I went with that title. Right. But anyway, set in the Bronze Age, getting into the Iron Age. So the whole riddle of steel thing that you see from the Conan movie, it's not really so much in Howard's writings, although it's hinted at. The reason it's hinted at that is because it is a hint to the actual ancient world where smiths, particularly bladesmiths or weaponsmiths, ironsmiths, were almost considered magicians or sorcerers themselves, working these spells into their craft, and that's how they produce these incredible weapons. Because of the untrained person, they had no idea smelting techniques and blade folding and all of these different techniques. So it was almost looked at as magical, and that's kind of where the whole theme of the riddle of steel comes from. I know people try to make more out of it, and it is. It's multi-layered, but if you want to get to the heart of it, it's really about the Iron Age, and then on top of that, people learning to make things out of iron, particularly weapons. But making steel, which is just it's just tempered iron, that's a little more flexible and a little stronger, and that took a couple of more little resources and little metallurgical secrets that some people didn't know, and so again, almost like a secretive sort of thing to forge steel. And then armor, typically wouldn't have been made from steel because it was kind of rare at the time, and so it became more and more more common, and more and more people know how to work it. Then you could kind of waste it on other things. But armor in that time would have still been bronze for a while. There might have been some reinforced areas that had iron on it. So maybe your shield had an iron boss or rim on it or something if you were lucky, or a helmet. But so anyway, that's another thematic thing. Sword and sorcery, at least particularly in Red Sun terms, how it's different from high fantasy. High fantasy is typically set in the High Middle Ages, all the way up into the Renaissance period, which is not my favorite. I know I'm kind of in the minority there. I actually kind of dial out after the 16th century. I don't find it quite as much interesting, and which is why I set Savage Kingdoms in the Dark Ages. Actually, you don't see a whole lot of RPGs set in the Dark Ages. And when I'm talking Dark Ages, I'm talking what historians kind of refer to it. We now know there's more to it, but still, it's kind of that 500-year period after Rome withdrew from Britannica, and then the kind of start of the Viking Age. But technically, the Dark Ages kind of goes into the early Vikings. So again, it's not precise, but most people know what you're talking about if you say the Dark Ages. You might also want to just say the pre-Middle Ages or the pre-High Middle Ages. That might carry some weight as far as kind of the broad term of Dark Ages go. So yeah, that's kind of the main differences, at least where I'm coming from with Red Sun, and I think that's about it. Oh wait, one more last thing. Um, Another thing that some of the other YouTubers I don't think really hit on when they were talking about high fantasy versus sword and sorcery is sorcery itself. Now we talked about swords, iron, bronze, the riddle of steel, that kind of thing. But sorcery, and remember what I said a few minutes ago, I don't like using the term magic too much. I think magic is a really good broad term or commoner's term to explain something that's not happening. But if you really want to break it down more in game terms or more like what a scholar would know about magic, you could really divide it into sorcery, miracles, maybe even alchemy. Alchemy back in the age, particularly in sword and sorcery stories, it's not the chemistry that we think of, where later medieval alchemy went into what we now call chemistry. Um, though there's elements of that, it's almost sorcery. It's a lot of mixtures of weird things and dust that you blow in people's faces, and acids and weird green stuff that explodes. I think Martin was hinting at that with his wildfire from Game of Thrones as this kind of weird alchemy, but mixed with like some ancient sorcery. So, again, breaking down the word magic, I think kind of breaks down into different things. But also in sword and sorcery, when you're saying the reason it's not called sword and magic, uh, well, two reasons. First, sword and sorcery sounds better than sword and magic. I think it just flows better with the S's. But because in sword and sorcery stories, magic or sorcery is typically darker and it's hard to trust, and fewer people know how to master it. So again, the parallel is being drawn to the blacksmith with the secret knowledge of how to make iron or steel weapons. So you have the dichotomy of swordcraft, and the sword maker, a rare thing, and sorcery. Only a few people know how to do that. So you almost really get craftsman versus scholar if you want to break it down. Um, but sorcery is dark in the fact that few people practice it. I think I mentioned it in the paragraph I read to you. It's often learned through eldritch pacts with hellish entities, demonic creatures, rotting scrolls written by half-human overlords or worse. Maybe on cave walls, some ancient formula was scrawled out, some ritual or something like that. And I think the reason why sorcery is dark in this time of age is because it's kind of unnatural. So it's almost sword and sorcery can almost be looked at as the natural world versus the supernatural or unnatural world. Another way to kind of break it down. Men, typically in sword and sorcery, humans particularly, when I say men, I mean uppercase, like humans, humankind, was not really, we weren't blessed with magical powers as we call it. And so in order to learn these kind of weird little tricks and shortcuts, so to speak, which is another reason it's looked at as dark, as kind of cheating in a way, men or humankind had to learn like blood sacrifices to entice entities to teach them spells, or mixing things together in alchemical formulas while spitting at it and cutting yourself on the full moon or something like that. So, in other words, it was always kind of a strange process, and it seemed to represent someone willing to commit and sacrifice to this thing, and perhaps also being susceptible to dark powers, leading them down dark paths. And that brings us to why many sorcerers and sword sorcery stories, particularly Conan and some of the others, Fritz Leiber, almost all the sorcerers are corrupt and nasty and evil in a sense, or actually literally are, because they have been willing to open their minds up to these corrupting forces to learn their craft, sorcery. So yeah, um, occasionally you meet like a sorcery. I think is a good example in the Conan saga is the Phoenix on the Sword. There was a priest of Mithras that Conan trusted. I don't think it was like best friends with the guy, but he was a sorcerer, like not all priests in the Hyperborn Age, but some. In fact, I wouldn't even say most. I would just say a few, some. So he was not only a priest of Mithras, but a sorcerer. At least knew some protective magics. I mean, he's the one that put talked about this, the phoenix on the sword and the protective magic and that kind of stuff. And Conan kind of trusted it because he was a priest of a religion that was predominantly part of the kingdom that he was, well, at the time, eventually would be king of Aquilonia. And so this was a little bit when Conan was a little bit older and a little more familiar with the cult of Mithras, thinking that okay, this is not too bad. It's pretty harmless, and also because this priest didn't use a lot of blood magic and a lot of flashy, nasty. Didn't summon demons. It was all. I think he usually just spoke warding magic, or in Red Sun would be mostly shadow magic, or maybe even life magic. In a sense of D&D, it was like abjuration, the school of abjuration, right? Protective magics. But so that's probably another reason you kind of trust them. So anyway, we're at about 27 minutes. I think I'm going to wrap it up. I just wanted to go into some difference between the sword and sorcery genre and high fantasy, and also how it kind of pretends how it plays into the Red Sun RPG, which I hope to release here in a couple of months. I'm just trying to let this whole post-Hurricane Helene thing kind of we're still trying to work stuff out around here in Western North Carolina, trying to get back to some sense of normality, trying to get our lives back together. So once that kind of figures itself out, then I'll focus a little bit more on trying to get the Red Sun game hopefully kickstarted. I'm also working on a new edition of Savage Kingdoms. I have both of them. Red Sun is about 95% done, so it's essentially just waiting. I just need to add a few more, write a little bit more, do another editing pass or three. That's mostly it. Then it's ready to be kickstarted because I need artwork and graphic design and all that typical stuff. So the next edition of Savage Kingdoms is I have about, I was about to say 40, but it's probably closer to 50% complete, maybe even more, maybe 55 or 60. So it's getting there. I'm leaning mostly towards kickstarting Red Sun first, maybe just slightly more, because it's new. Savage Kingdoms, I still love it. I'm glad you guys enjoy it, or at least most of you, and I'm still committed. It's been 10 and a half years since the first edition. So edition 4 now coming up after just 10 and a half, 11 years. It might seem a little much, even for a small indie game that needs to reinvent itself more often than like a larger game. So I don't know. We will see. We'll see what the next couple of months bring with the holidays and post Helene and hurricane stuff and all that. So anyway, thanks for paying attention. If you made it this far, everyone, I apologize. My light is failing behind me. I waited too late in the day to record this in my mom's sunroom in the back of her house, which is where I'm still sheltering. We might be headed back in the next day or two to my home in Asheville, Swannanoa area. So anyway, thanks for paying attention, guys, and I will talk to you again soon. Thanks.